Okay, I wanted to say, first of all, it is an honor to welcome you all, both the in-person audience and the online audience, today for our Robert J. Katz Research Fellow Lecture in Anti-Semitism Studies. This lecture is thanks to the Robert J. Katz Research Fellowship in Anti-Semitism Studies, which was established by longtime USC Shoah Foundation Board of Counselors member and its former chair, Robert J. Katz. The fellowship allows advanced level doctoral candidates from any discipline and university in the world the opportunity to spend 1 month in residence at the USC Shoah Foundation, advancing their research on anti-Semitism. This fellowship is only one of the many ways that Robert Katz continues to support the work of the USC Shoah Foundation and reinforces its commitment to Holocaust scholarship and education. We're deeply grateful to Bob and for his continuous commitment to our mission and work. On behalf of our Director of Academic Programs, Dr. Jennifer Rogers, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, we have the sincere pleasure of hosting Christina Wirth, or Worth, as I'm going to probably mangle it, and I apologize for that. So Christina has been an academic staff member at the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz, Germany since 2021. She studied history and German philology, as well as educational studies at the Georg August University Göttingen, Germany, and at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel. Christina was a student assistant for a German medieval dictionary, the Arolsen Archives, and the chair of theory and methods of history at Göttingen. After completing her master's, she's worked as an academic staff member at the Federal State Archive Sachsen-Anhalt, where she created teaching material on Jewish history of the state. She is currently working on her PhD dissertation entitled Legal Bureaucratic Human Categorization in the Post-War Period, from Displaced Persons to Refugees, in quotation marks. Her research interests are in the field of history of migration, Jewish history, Holocaust studies, and the didactics of history. So a big welcome to you, Christina, from all of us. And the lecture will go approximately 50 minutes.
Yes, maybe I can shorten it down to 45, but we'll be 50, I guess.
In the ballpark. And then we'll have questions at the end, both if people in the room can save them to the end of the lecture. And then we'll also be taking questions from the online audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can as time allows. So with that said, I'll pass the floor over to Christina.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction, Crispin. I also take the moment to say a few acknowledgements. Obviously, I want to thank Robert J. Katz too for making it possible for me to be here. I am incredibly grateful that all of you joined in the room and online. Robert J. Katz made it possible for me to be the first fellow in anti-Semitism studies, and that is, especially in times like these, a great honor. I want to thank the Shoah Foundation's colleagues and friends I found here over the last 2 months. I'd like to thank my friends at the Temple Beth Hillel, at Der Nista, and especially Charlene Woods, because they were making my fellowship a truly meaningful journey for me as a young historian. So let's dive into the topic. This year, 2024, is the anniversary of the deportation of the Hungarian Jews. Over 8 weeks in spring 1944, about 424,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, where upon arrival and after selection, the majority of them were murdered in gas chambers by SS functionaries. Around 20% of the arriving deportees were selected as prisoners and used for forced labor or in medical experiments. Today, I will focus on a group of Jewish women from Hungary that were deported to Auschwitz and then transferred to a Buchenwald subcamp in the city of Lippstadt, Westphalia in Germany, where they worked as forced laborers in an ammunition factory. They were liberated by the US Ninth Army from a so-called death march in a village of Kaunitz, which is also located in Westphalia, on April 1st, 1945. I will discuss the close encounters of these women with their American liberators, with the Germans, as well as with the humanitarian aid workers and British authorities who arrived a few months after liberation. Although Kaunitz was liberated by the American Army as part of the Allied encircling of the Ruhr Pocket, it later became part of the British occupation zone. Since neither Jewish life nor anti-Semitism vanished in 1945, I will explore Jewish experiences of anti-Semitism by presenting a case study of the post-war sorting processes that shaped the category of the Jewish displaced persons. Let me say a few words on my theoretical approach before I get into my case study of the Hungarian women in Kaunitz. Following Peter Gatrol's endorsement that historical research should focus on flight and expulsion by comparing bureaucratic practices to the individual's needs, numerous projects illustrated a discrepancy between both. By examining the experience of displaced persons, one can observe a clear discrepancy between the needs of the displaced persons as individuals and the practice of both bureaucratic institutions and humanitarian aid initiatives. With my case study of Kaunitz, I am to illuminate the gap between the internationally promoted stance towards Jews, described by Gerard Daniel Cohen as philosemitic, and the situational handling and categorization of Jews that, as I will try to prove, is oftentimes connected to anti-Semitism. Moreover, I will question if part of the philosemitism promoted by international agents was connected to anti-Semitic sentiments. Last but not least, I will question whether the forms of anti-Semitism I encounter within my case study, particularly regarding the German narratives towards the Jews, can be seen as a manifestation of post-Shoah anti-Semitism. In order to do so, I'm trying to historize current research on anti-Semitism, mostly conducted by social scientists, such as Klaus Holz or Thomas Haury, who are working on contemporary anti-Semitism. So let's take a closer look on April 1st, 1945, from different perspectives. Based on the insight of liberators, liberated prisoners, Germans, aid workers, and the British administration, I will zoom out to the bureaucracy and categorizations behind and around the events and demonstrate how anti-Semitism has played a role in post-war sorting processes. Liberators' perspective. The Allied forces were prepared to find millions out of place by 1944. The Allied forces classified these individuals as displaced persons, short DP. DPs ranged from Jewish Shoah survivors, former forced laborers, to prisoners of war, refugees that fled the Soviet army, or Nazis in disguise. Therefore, the Allies established a number of subcategories, such as United Nations DPs or ex-NAD DPs, and so on. Initially categorized by nationalities, Jewish DPs soon were to be referred to as stateless. This already points to the discussion of Jewish survivors from their pre-war countries of citizenship, which contradicts the idea of repatriation. At the close of March 1945, the region of Westphalia, where the Jewish women were liberated, was a battlefield as part of the Allied encircling of the Ruhr Pocket. And while liberating Germany from the Nazi rule, the Allied forces encountered DPs in Westphalia. There was never a particular plan to build a DP assembly center called short DPAC in Kaunitz, and the soldiers, who were not accompanied by any humanitarian aid workers or any other organization, decided on the spot to acquire German houses and let the Jewish women they encountered stay there, very much to the dislike of the villagers and the mayor. This particular American Army division, the 30th Infantry Division of the 9th Corps of the 9th US American Army, had neither encountered Jews nor female survivors in Germany before. They had to make sure these individuals they found were indeed liberated from a concentration camp and tested if they were Jewish by asking them either in Yiddish if they were Yidden, Jews, or by showing them mezuzahs and asking them to name the item. Even though I argue that the empathy for the suffering of the women, both as women and as Jews, and the urge to help them led to the requisition of German houses, the official reasoning behind it was demobilization. The German army had not yet officially surrendered, and all forms of transportation were to be used by the Allied forces only. On April 2nd, the Americans ordered the Bürgermeister, the mayor of Kaunitz, to organize food and other material goods for the women. By April 18th, they took over full responsibility for the maintenance and care of the women and other DPs that settled in Kaunitz. Meanwhile, Jewish perspective. When the fighting came closer, the Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, and Polish women were forcibly evacuated from Lippstadt on foot away from the battle lines without food or water, guarded by male and female SS. The guards stopped the group of women in this open field and forced them to lay down while American bombers flew over them. All surviving witnesses described what occurred then. Their guards suddenly threw away their uniforms and left the group unattended. The big group decided to walk towards the Allied forces. Some met them on the road, others in the center of town. What happened next is known as liberation, the end of the Shoah for these women, but by far not the end of their suffering. Moving scenes occur. The oldest conveyed testimony about the events in Kaunitz stem from Anna Kalecka from 1946. He describes the liberation in Yiddish, which translates to the following. And here we were, almost crazy. We didn't have a strip of anything white. Somebody had a bandage around a wounded leg, and that bandage was raised at an approaching American tank, and the women prostrate themselves on the ground, kissing the wheels. The Americans thought it was a house of the insane. They looked at us, and how we looked, all in tatters, and speaking, nobody could. We were all speechless. And they would jump off the tanks and they were kissing us who were dirty and covered in lice. Do not weep, they would say, but we wept more and more. And incessantly the tears ran. The Ninth Army had not seen any Jews in Germany, and we thought that we were the only Jewish survivors. And we did not want to live. Liberation was a shock to many survivors, as Dan Stone has argued. They were desperately waiting for it, but once it was there, they were unprepared for it. Of course, not all 800 women experienced this moment in the same way, but all do mention the warmth of the American soldiers and how that did not at all correspond to their feelings about their feelings towards themselves. Anna's attempt to describe how the surviving women looked like, which almost left her speechless, attributes to them that they looked insane, dirty, covered in lies. And many testimonies use similar language or use animal metaphors to describe their state. This discrepancy between their self-perception and the soldiers' perception is a result of the years of dehumanization under the Nazi rule. From then on, Irene Shapiro takes the lead in talking to the Americans and what will happen next. She was part of the group that was encountered by the Americans on the road. Irene's story is remarkable, and it's not at all surprising that she does take the lead. She herself grew up in Hungary in a very assimilated and highly educated Jewish home, joined the Zionist Hashomer Hatzair movement at an early age, and was part of the resistance of the Bialystok ghetto. Her agency and resilience is fascinating. She illustrates the scene like this. Later at the end, in front of all the girls, come on, Irene, you speak English, go. I go with a blanket on me. There stands the Yankee tank with a gum-chewing Yankee nonchalantly looking at me and laughing. And after describing the situation, of her group to the soldiers, she goes on and says, "We occupied the town. The 200-some women chased the Germans out and lived in the town with the Americans' help. The Americans helped the Jewish women to acquire houses. Some of them were unoccupied because the German villagers had fled for the bombings. Every single testimony describes the joy of being in a home, of having food, water, and clothes. Most outstanding is Jean Fabian's description of her joy. She describes the moment when the soldiers moved her into the village of Kaunitz. She says, "Kaunitz is a small town, and when we walked in at the first place, we saw a big sign written in German, this and that, Bezirk Minden. Minden was the county's or whatever's name, but in Hungarian, Minden means everything. And we joke right away, we have everything, we have Minden." So to the German perspective on what happened. What was for the Jewish survivors the biggest joy, the joy of having Minden, of having everything, was for the Germans in Kaunitz a tragedy, as Maria Fromme puts it. She herself was 13 years old and driven out of her farm by 6 Jewish women and American soldiers on April 1st, 1945. For her wedding anniversary in 2005, she wrote down a memoir of the events in 1945. This memoir shows little empathy towards the Jewish women and what they have been through, and concentrates on what they have supposedly done to her and her family. Her description of the takeover of her house sounds terrifying. It portrays the Jewish women as invasive and the American soldiers as merciless. Fromme and her family were allowed back on their farm after 10 days. They weren't permitted in the main house and lived in a shed, which nonetheless had a fully functioning kitchen. From Fromme's account, one can read that she was frightened, especially because the Jews supposedly had good connections with the Americans. She lists several incidents of the women making up false accusations to convince the Americans to worsen the German situation. Moreover, she explains that the Jews had no empathy towards her family and constantly compared her experience to what happened to them during the Shoah. Towards the end of her account, she writes about friendly relations. The last 2 women left her house in 1948, and she summarizes, "My parents, along with us 9 children, had to start entirely anew, and so did our Jewish roommates." A strong reversal of victims and perpetrators is apparent in Fromme's account, and also conveyed in the German administrational sources by the former Bürgermeister, mayor of Kaunitz. In his report to his superior about the events in April 1945, the Jews are being described as aggressive and power abusive. He focuses mainly around mean behavior and criminality of those who he terms as the foreigners. He states that many Germans feared revenge on behalf of the Jewish women, and revenge can be read as anti-Semitic image stemming from Christian anti-Semitism. The post-war German society created an entire myth around the criminal activity of DPs. Research, however, shows that DP criminality remained equal or slightly below the German crime rates. The accusations, especially when they are raised in connection with black market activity, stem from the old image of the deceptive Jew. The repeated references of the German suffering outside of their homes and the persistent demand to place Jews in an assembly center is striking in his reports. In order not to be housed elsewhere, the women actively protested, which again is perceived as them being mean and uncooperative. The Bürgermeister constantly makes up new reasons why the Jewish women should be placed elsewhere, such as the prevention of disease, the purported danger of the Jews demoralizing the younger generation, both clearly anti-Semitic, of course. Another recurrent topic regards their sexuality. The Bürgermeister repeatedly complains about the lack of morals and calls out orgies that are being held between the Jews, the prisoners of wars, and visiting soldiers. He tries to justify his complaint with the fear of German and, I quote, better-minded Jewish women alike. He also tries to demand the British humanitarian aid worker Lily Holt to prevent sexual acts. He is especially outraged by a male DP having an affair with a German woman. Holt calls him off by saying, "Stick a chastity belt around her if you wish, if you want to go back to things like that." Even though this account seems humorous, it conveys anti-Semitic notions, playing on the taboo of Jewish men sleeping with German women. Sexuality in itself is a topic that preoccupied the anti-Semitic imagination. The image of Jewish sexuality they created was paradox. In their eyes, at the same time, Jewish men were unmanly and overly masculine, and therefore dangerous to women. And Jewish women, on the other hand, were either too seductive or victims of predation. This is, of course, not entirely the case. Of course, there were also affairs going on. Obviously, things happen. There's a lot of research on that. But what is different is how the Burgermeister speaks about it. What in Lily Holt's case can be described as a form of patronizing, the Burgermeister frames his entire argument on anti-Semitism. So regarding the topic of framing, it is also outstanding that the Burgermeister seems to be hesitant to use the word Jew, though it does occur the women are mostly called foreigners or simply women. It appears that the term Jew is not needed to imply the anti-Semitic stereotypes. And I would like to dive deeper into anti-Semitism conveyed by Fromme and the Burgermeister, especially regarding the German fear and their self-victimization. In her research, Atina Grossmann concentrates on the issue of real versus imagined German misery. She states that Germans collectively understood themselves as victims, first of the Nazi regime that had lured them into the war, and then of the bombings, expulsions, harsh denazification, and ruined society that were the result of defeat. Additionally, she underlines their immunity to any sense of collective guilt. With Frank Bie's research on German angst, one can shed light on the issue of fear. He underlines that Germans increasingly believe that Allied powers would use Nazi policy as a model in their treatment of a defeated Germany. This was also the period when Germans began to see themselves as victims of allegedly Jewish revenge, or even as being in the same position as Jewish victims. Which becomes apparent in Fromme's closing sentence, I guess. Therefore, it is not unusual that Fromme and the Burgermeister have so little empathy and are victimizing themselves and the entire village of Kaunitz. The fear of retribution and revenge was a result of Nazi propaganda towards the end of the war, and also marks a shift within German nationalism. To those occupied, defeated, and unsure of their future, it was important to belong to a national community that needed a scapegoat to cover up the negative deeds of their own group. It becomes apparent that neither German nationalism nor anti-Semitism vanished, and in accordance with anti-Semitism studies, I claim that both nationalism and anti-Semitism are indeed entangled, especially in the post-Shoah time. The main aspect of post-Shoah anti-Semitism is the reversal of victim and perpetrator. This reversal, victim and perpetrator, allowed anti-Semitism to continue in an environment where the discussion of guilt is ever present. That's where the emphasis on the term post and post-Shoah anti-Semitism becomes relevant. According to Lyotard, the prefix post doesn't simply imply an after without consequences on the before. It implies that the before has to be processed, and that's essential here. The new form of anti-Semitism isn't a simple Shoah denial. According to Holz and Haury, it is a reinterpretation of what happened during the Shoah and the guilt connected to it. And it's important for the political subject in Germany to reframe this sort of anti-Semitism. In the post-Shoah world, the anti-Semite cannot simply evade the topic. So instead of evading the Shoah, new interpretations have to be offered in order to facilitate anti-Semitism on the one hand and a sense of belonging on the other. Nationalism usually concentrates positive achievements of nations, and accordingly, the surviving Jew seems to be the personalized reminder of the German skill and stands in their way to national pride. The reversal of victim and perpetrator in this context is then a useful tool to allow for nationalism, to allow for the idea of us versus them. Thus, post-Shoah anti-Semitism and nationalism are closely intervened in the German case. Aid worker and administrator's perspective. What figured in the German mind in Kaunitz as tragedy was managed by the British military administration from June 45 until the beginning of 48. The British administration absorbed the occupied houses in Kaunitz into the DP Camp Assembly Center system. DPAC Kaunitz stands out for being an all-Jewish camp by accident. Belsenkamp, also located in the British zone, not far from Kaunitz, only became entirely Jewish by May 1946, after immense pressure from DPs, humanitarian aid organizations, and international bodies. Whereas the critical Harrison report commissioned by President Truman catalyzed the creation of Jewish-only DP camps in the American zone in August 1945 and led to the recognition of Jews as distinctive group among the DPs in Allied policies and UN agencies, the British administrators held to the line that recognition of Jews as anything other than a religious or cultural community was adopting Nazi classification. The British had a very strict policy to remind the DPs that the DPACs were not to be long-term installation and restricted opportunities for self-government. Nevertheless, they installed the Polish Jew, Nathan Neumann, as camp leader and representative of the Jewish Committee in Kaunitz, which by then consisted of men and women. Furthermore, the British Jewish Relief Unit, short JRU, sent 2 Jewish relief workers to Kaunitz in the beginning of 1946, Lily Holt and Selma Shelby. The JRU was a small but significant Anglo-Jewish aid agency that operated primarily in the British zone of occupation and worked under the umbrella of the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And UNRWA's main task was, next to the relief and rehabilitation that's already mentioned in their name, to trace relatives and to organize repatriations of the DPs. Several testimonies with Lily Holt and Helen Bamber, one of her superiors, are conveyed, and they reveal an interesting shift in how the surviving DPs were seen and therefore categorized by the British. Lily Holt, a young Jewish woman from London, arrived in Kaunitz in March 1946, and the DPs were quite different what she had expected and trained for. She describes that she has been chosen to go to Germany because she had a background in physical education, and the JRU leadership thought that the DPs would be needing to get back in physical shape. And that was not at all what she encountered. She arrived in Kaunitz and finds most of the DPs to be overweight. She calls them fat and explains that they only had a very unbalanced diet. Instead of being in desperate need for help, they had settled and approached her with specific queries regarding childcare, education, and immigration. Upon her arrival, the camp consisted of approximately 360 people, mostly Hungarian women and Polish men. The discrepancy between what Lily has been trained for and what she found didn't change her attitude. And that's significant. What stands out is her close connection to the DPs. In her testimony, the DPs do not seem like an anonymous mass of people. She names them, she has connections to them. Even after the war, she's very involved. Her positive reception of the DPs, despite what she thought they might be like, seems unique. as most people who came after the liberation as either administrators or aid workers perceived the DPs very differently. Helen Bamber was only briefly in Kaunitz and made the following observation. The word survivor or victim had gone out of their vocabulary, and the word displaced person, which is a sort of anonymous term for a glob of people, is quite useful as a shield. So the compassion that was there at the beginning and the sense of outrage when the camp was liberated has gone, in my view. Helen Bamber's observation about a shift in naming and therefore in treatment and in regard to compassion is essential to my argument. Many organizations complained about the attitude towards the survivors by the British and American administrators, soldiers, and non-Jewish aid workers. It is conveyed that they saw the survivors' political self-organization as nuisance. Furthermore, they were aggravated by the Jewish supposedly being demanding, ungrateful, lazy, untidy, arrogant, and unruly, in contrast to the very obedient Germans and other DP groups. Many found the German suffering in contrast to the good lives of the DPs disproportional and felt sympathy towards the Germans instead, reaffirming the German self-narrative I talked about earlier. A favoritism towards DPs from Western countries, or DPs that were, according to racist and classist stereotypes and by the emerging Cold War, considered better or more useful than Jews, also occurred. Therefore, Jewish DPs of Eastern European origin were discriminated against from many employment and immigration schemes. Jews in the DP camps were also often stereotyped as lethargic. So what happened between the joyous moment in April 45 until Lily Holt's arrival in March 46? What changed? Why did the sympathy seem to have gone for most of the helpers and administrators? The Hungarian women found themselves exhausted and sick from what they went through. The Germans provided only one social worker and a priest to their aid, and the American soldiers, although they were being very caring, were not trained for social service or to deal with civilians and their PTSD. The one thought that preoccupied all the survivors' minds was the question of survival and the survival of the loved ones. Irene Shapira, whom I mentioned earlier, went to Belsen camp numerous times because people told her they saw her mother there. She believed the rumors and went to look for her mom. Her frustration was very high, and she came to terms with the fact that the stories about her mother in Belsen just were not true, and she indeed died in Auschwitz, where Irene left her in 1944. Similar to Anna Kalecka's account from 46, where she believed the women of Kaunitz were the only survivors, most other survivors considered themselves as She'erit HaPletar in Hebrew, or She'eris HaPlete in Yiddish, the last remnant, a biblical term relating to the safe remnant that escaped destruction and carries the promise of the future. Most women of Kaunitz, even though identifying as She'erit HaPletar, did not yet think about immigration and rather decided to go home. This was in accordance with what the administration supported and what the term DP indicates, repatriation for those who have been displaced from somewhere. Officially, the first repatriation of the surviving women of Kaunitz took place on June 26, 45. On that day, some 250 Hungarian and Czechoslovakian women were repatriated with the help of the Red Cross, among them Claire Weiss. She went back home with the organized repatriation, but had already put her name down to be published in an American newspaper, and her uncle, here in the United States, sent her an affidavit, and she could migrate to the US. In 1946 already, she ended up living here in Los Angeles. Some Jewish DPs took the matter in their own hands and did not want to wait for official repatriation. Flora Gross joined a group and made their way back to Hungary, but home did not feel home anymore. Only one of her 8 sisters survived. She decided to save money in order to emigrate and was accepted to settle in Australia in 1949. Not every woman in Kaunitz that went back to Hungary was lucky enough to leave again. Mary Gethy faced discrimination in communist Hungary. She states that after my return to Hungary, we were considered enemies of a communist state. And I was in constant persecution for one reason or another. In the first instance, for being born Jewish, and then to be a descendant of capitalist parents. So I happened to be a public enemy all my life. She was among those who fled the country after the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and emigrated to Australia. Hungary, of course, was not the only country that was hostile to returning Jews, especially the horrors of the Kielce pogrom in Poland in 1946 and the overall anti-Semitism in their former home countries created a mass exodus of Jews that fled into the DP camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Zionism became the popular expression of hope, as it provided sense of belonging for those who lost their relatives and a sense of home for those who lost their homes. Due to this mass exodus, almost 50% of the DP camps were filled with what the administrators called infiltrates by 1946. Most of them survived the Shoah in hiding or in the Soviet Union, but also referred to themselves as She'erit HaPleta. At first, they were not allowed to receive DP status at all, but after the Harrison Report and the reversal of American policies toward Holocaust survivors, the US Army eventually allowed Jewish infiltrees to enter DP camps, and they, in due course, convinced UNRWA to adjust its criteria regarding what they then called post-hostility refugees. In this changing atmosphere, DPAC Kaunitz changes. More and more DPs refused to be repatriated. There were constantly about 350 DPs in the DP camp in Kaunitz between 46 and the beginning of 47. And at that time, Zionist sentiment grew in Kaunitz and in other DP camps. The Jewish Committee committed lectures in Hebrew, had an Israeli flag in its clubroom, and wrote articles in the Yiddish-speaking newspaper Unsere Stimme, Our Voice. Only after the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, takes over UNRWA's task and offers resettlement schemes elsewhere, the situation changes. Even though Zionism was quite popular among the Jewish DPs, not all of them made the journey to Palestine or later Israel. They instead settled in the US, Canada, or Australia after they opened their borders for them. Irene Shapiro, for example, though she grew up supporting Zionism, migrated to the US, since she did not want to get involved in another war. This phenomenon is common, and therefore scholars speak about a therapeutic Zionism that facilitated hope and didn't necessarily mean that all DPs did want to go to Israel. When it became apparent that not all DPs would be resettled elsewhere, the Allied authorities started to figure out policies for what they called the hardcore. After the establishment of special resettlement schemes, it was decided to include the remnant into the West German social welfare state as what they called stateless foreigners, Heimatlose, Ausländer. Most DPs in Kaunitz were successfully repatriated or resettled. For the small number of remaining DPs in the city administration of Bale took over them and the responsibility over them in December 1947. In the beginning of 48, Kaunitz stops being a DP camp. A year later, only 40 Jewish women and men remained in Kaunitz, and the German administration offered them a choice. They could either stay in Kaunitz under the administration of the Germans, leaving and losing their DP status, or go to a different DP camp in the area and try to be resettled elsewhere. Earlier, when I discussed the German anti-Semitism, it was quite obvious, even though hidden behind the reversal of victim and perpetrator. Detecting anti-Semitism in administration and international policy is more abstract, less obvious, and paradoxical. Two things seem to be contradictory. First, the promotion to treat Jewish DPs better by allowing their own DP camps and by acknowledging their suffering under the Nazi rule, in contrast to the ill treatment in these DP camps. Second, the discrepancy between the emerging international philo-Semitism that Cohen rightfully observed in the post-war world and the refusal to allow Jews into many resettlement schemes, not welcoming them to the countries and instead supporting their quest for recognition as a nation and thereby extending their extraterritorial suffering in Germany. Humanitarian aid and migration studies help to dismantle the first paradox. As Johannes Paumann stresses, there's a difference between ideal help promoted by governmental agents and the implementation of help on a local level. Do you think I should stop for the Zoom audience or no? I don't know, maybe. So maybe I just keep speaking as well. Something happens. Okay, so let me get back to the idea of ideal help, right? So there's a difference between ideal help that's being promoted by governmental agents and the implementation of help on the local level. And that's exactly what we saw in Kaunitz. So regarding the handling of DPs, it is not surprising that those who had worked with them on a day-to-day basis may have been annoyed by them. The phenomenon is widely recognized as an ongoing problem until today. Until today, people who receive aid are being seen as annoyance to those who are giving aid. The difference, though, between then and today is the channeling of sympathy away from the Jews towards the Germans and other DPs who are seen as a better fit for oncoming post-war needs. In contrast to what the policies were promoting, the assistance of those most in need, the employment schemes clearly show a favoritism to those who are not the most vulnerable. It ought to be debated whether or not that by itself can be seen as anti-Semitic. I'm not sure myself. And now to the issue of philo-Semitism, which I admit will be a bit complicated, so don't get lost. Cohen and others convincingly argue that international bodies on a global stage promoted the plight of the Jews to become a nation as a direct outcome of their political agenda setting in the DP camps. We saw in Kaunitz, the Zionist activity, they're having a newspaper, they're promoting themselves all the time. The Harrison report stands out as the turning point of international recognition of a Jewish nationality, and their statelessness was affirmed. And the US pressured Great Britain to open the gates of Palestine, and Zionism was indeed supported. This clearly indicates an unprecedented form of philo-Semitism. But there seems to be a backside to this story, especially because of my findings regarding the exclusion of Jews from entering certain countries or the limitation of allowed numbers. I read philo-Semitism as anti-Semitism's accessory and argue that some anti-Semitic resentments played a role for international governments in supporting the Zionist case. Most obvious is the case of the Soviet Union that actively supported the plight of the Jews at a time when a mass exodus due to anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union occurred. Cohen himself established this without calling it anti-Semitism. He argues, while undeniably attuned to Jewish suffering, the Soviet Union never formally claimed Jews as their own displaced nationals, resulting in transformed ethnic landscapes with few or no Jews at all. Less extreme cases, like limiting immigration permits to young and able-bodied Jewish survivors into America with the famous DP Act of 1950, instead of helping the most vulnerable, like the elderly or the diseased, first shows more of an economization than anti-Semitism, I would say. But, and now that's the complicated part, it is worth to consider if the philo-Semitic attitude should be theorized as anti-Semitism, at least partly. Again, I would like to turn to anti-Semitism studies. The mechanisms I described regarding the processing of the events of the Shoah by the Germans are and must be transferable to other countries and settings. Obviously, the Shoah did not affect Germany, not affect only Germany, but the entire post-World War order. Therefore, all players had to locate themselves within the events, asking whether or not they carry partial guilt of what happened. And once the question of guilt is on the table, it is easier to support the plight of the Jews and therefore extend their stay in extraterritorial limbo in the DP camps, rather than admitting masses into one's own country and help fighting and advocating for them, with them there. Consequently, national states can avoid the question of partial complicity in the events by helping the Jews settle in Palestine, as if they were never part of one's own country, as the Soviet Union example underlines. Similar to the reversal of victim and perpetrator, the relentless supporting of formerly victimized Jewish survivors can provide a sense of exonerating. I know that was a lot. Let me try to sum up how to draw a conclusion. So the presence of anti-Semitism immediately after the Shoah is oftentimes forgotten, though thousands of Jews were threatened by anti-Semitic pogroms, hostile governments, and by anti-Semitic tendencies of some of those who were administering the DPs. By analyzing the close encounters of the Hungarian Jewish women encounters with the liberators, Germans, as well as the humanitarian aid workers and British authorities, and contrasting them to the international policymaking, I was able to detect different forms of anti-Semitism. I argued that the form of anti-Semitism I encountered regarding the German narrative towards the Jews can be seen as a manifestation of post-Shoah anti-Semitism. Additionally, I discovered that the discrepancy between ideal help and the actual implementation of aid in the DP camps that led to the ill treatment of the DPs was driven by many factors, among them the loss of empathy for the vulnerable by their administrators that is so common for relief workers until today. In this context, I questioned if anti-Semitism is the sole explanation for this phenomenon. Additionally, I tried to broaden Cohen's claim of philo-Semitism by reading it as being intertwined with anti-Semitism. Every nation in the post-war world order had to relate their politics to the events of the Shoah, sometimes by accidentally affirming the narratives of post-Shoah anti-Semitism.
Take a moment to, did you lose something? You want to take over my computer so we can see you?
Sure. But how will that work?
You can stay there, you can just,
Will you see the question?
oh, yeah, well.
You can just sit next to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, I'll come over and sit next to
So
you.
sorry for the online audience, my laptop died. It is. But I hope you were able to hear me, because I think I was making the most interesting argument in the end, so.
So I just want to check, if the online audience can confirm there's audio, everyone can hear, okay? Yeah. So I guess, I have a few questions, but I wanted to go to a question from the chat first. And it came, thank you for confirming you can hear, very much appreciated. So the first question on the from the online came from Irving Saltzman. My father was a Holocaust survivor from southeastern Poland, near Yaroslav. He spent 3 years in a DP camp in Schwandorf in Bavaria, Germany, in the American zone. I realize your case study was limited to Kaunitz, but how much of your findings would be applicable to the experience of Jews in other DP camps?
Thank you, Irving. for joining and for raising that question. So I specifically concentrated on the British zone of occupation because it was treating Jews more negatively and more extreme than the American zone of occupation. And therefore, their experiences are quite different to the one in America, especially after the Harrison report came in. The situation of Jews in the American zone was way better, and Jews from the other zones fled into the American zone. That being said, that does not mean it's a perfect situation. They were still waiting in this limbo that I tried to explain. They were still not knowing what will be going on. And also their administrators were annoyed. There are several incidences conveyed about Americans being aggressive, being annoyed. All the things are just attributed to the British can be said about the American administrators as well.
By the way, I forgot to say thank you for a really, really informative and thoughtful and in-depth talk. I have like quite a few questions, and I'll ask some of them, but I don't want to dominate. So we'll also go sort of intersperse it with ones from the chat. So, gosh, where to start? I was really interested in, and this might be my ignorance, I didn't know about this, but you were talking about the myth of DP criminality, and that there had been research into that. I'm wondering if you could just kind of delve into that a little bit more and explain, what the research has showed and that, because that was really interesting to me.
I think it's especially interesting because most people, also surviving Jews, will attest to that statement that DP criminality was incredibly high. Criminality can mean a lot of things, right? It could be black marketing, it can be forcing people to give aid or give certain things to people. So the biggest research that was made on DP criminality, or the situation of DPs in general, was made by a German called Jakob Meyer. And he just looked at numbers. He went to police reports and noticed there's a difference. So this entire narrative actually reaffirms the myth of the Germans saying themselves, victimizing themselves, repeating this is so high. That does not mean there was no criminality. I think back in this time after the war, there was a lot of criminality going on, but just by comparing the numbers, the German criminality rate wasn't significantly lower.
And that's interesting. It's one of my other questions, but in terms of sources, because this is using, I guess, police reports or actual convictions and that kind of thing to draw those conclusions, is that what you?
Yeah, but my yes.
I guess my question was, what were some of the sources you used in terms of documenting what you did in your lecture today? Where did they come from? So some of them I was kind of looking up to see if they were Shoah Foundation interviews, and then some of them you mentioned, I was looking to see where they were from. But can you talk a bit more about your source material?
Yes, I would love to. So for the bureaucratic view, I go to city archives. I went to the UN archives, which is, I think, the most common thing for historians to do. So that would be less interesting, especially in the context of being in the Shoah Foundation. But what I try to do, and I think that's quite unique is to facilitate oral history. So the USHMM was there. I went to the Imperial War Museum, and the entire reason for me to be here is to use the material of the Shoah Foundation. So many of the quotes I mentioned while I was talking, they are definitely from the oral histories here. And it's amazing to use them, especially because by the guidelines of the Shoah Foundation, there is always this short part of them talking about their survival, talking about the time after the Holocaust. Because oftentimes I encounter fascinating faces, like in this Kaunitz case, I encounter someone who was liberated in Kaunitz, and then the interview ends. And that's exactly what I'm not interested in. I want to know what happened after, and I think that's a problem that's connected to survival anyways, because people try to concentrate on the killing, the death, losing of people, instead of looking in depth into what happened next. How is it possible to survive? But yet, even though this being said, and it's a very small portion of every interview, there is enough to draw conclusions, to hear them.
And because it was sort of interesting, I'm wondering what the sources are that document this. You talk about kind of the difference in terminology that's used for the people. So they go from survivors to displaced persons, DPs, and then you've got terms like, infiltrees, and then stateless foreigners, and I'm wondering, you know, where those terms are popping up in the kind of, in terms of the source materials that you have. So how are you able to trace that kind of movement in the language for the same group of people?
There's several ways to do that. I think the most interesting part is that most Jewish DPs, while surviving in their testimonies, call themselves survivors or even use the term She'erit Habletam, and they do not talk about the DP time and call themselves DPs. Whereas, and that's part of my research, other DP groups, for example, those who fled the Red Army and ended up in Germany and were complicit with the Nazis, for them, the term DP is incredibly important because that was the first time they had ever been deprived of their rights, put into a mass classification. So to them, that's the moment where DP actually plays a role within their biographies, whereas Jewish DPs talk about the moment when they were deprived of their rights, which happened during National Socialism. So in order to trace that, and that's kind of a problem when I look at oral history, I look closely into the times, framings, and places they talk about, and then you can combine, for example, a statistic of such and such DPs. Let's say United Nations DPs were reported on that day from counted to 100. The DP or the survivor themselves might have not say it in that way, but I can add their story to the administrational sources and thereby see when does which label is important to which group.
Going to the chat again. Oops, pull it up here. Let's see. Okay, question from Itamar Krastovsky. Many of the forms of anti-Semitism you talked about consulting today, have you seen in your studies ways of combating anti-Semitism we can learn from today?
Thank you, Itamar, for being here. Itamar and I lived together in New York for a little while, so it's nice to have you here. I knew the question of combating anti-Semitism came up, and I think the most important outcome of my study, which next to anti-Semitism also concentrates on migration and experience of expulsion, it is very important to listen to the individuals, because the main part I talked about today was the issue of administrators and aid workers not listening to the plight of the people entirely, making up new categorizations or just using parts of what the survivors said they wanted for their international policy making. So in that regard, to fight anti-Semitism is obviously to listen to the Jews and their plight. And besides that, I did talk about historical anti-Semitism, and obviously the topic of Zionism and the establishment of Israel was part of it. But I think the beginning of what I described as post-Shoah anti-Semitism is what led to the anti-Semitism we see here in all over the world right now. So unfortunately, I don't have the best solution for combating it, but it's very important to talk about it, to make it visible, and in what I just tried to do in my lecture, to also include every country, not saying that anyone is free of the sentiment.
In terms of kind of argument today, I'm wondering that there were some bits that were clearer to me, and there were bits that I was reflection on me, struggling to follow as clearly. So the part about the German kind of post-Shoah anti-Semitism, that made sense to me. And then in terms of the kind of implementation of help and the ideal and the actual, and the loss of empathy, the kind of changing approaches of the Allied administrations to the Jewish DPs, or whatever term we're using, that was clear. I was struggling to understand your argument about the sort of the way that you can view the philo-Semitism that the sort of emerged, I guess, in the late 1940s. The way that was kind of, you seem to be arguing, if I'm not misreading or mishearing you, you were sort of saying that there was sort of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes, perhaps, in the formulation of that. And then I probably completely misunderstood this, but if I wrote it down a note, were you saying that the sudden sort of change in the support for Jews to emigrate to Palestine, were you arguing that was kind of a pushing out to kind of absolve blame for what happened locally? Or am I
Partly. So
Okay,
what
yeah.
I tried to say about the part of philo-Semitism that supported the plight to go to Palestine, in contrast to one's own policy, the idea was, and I mean, I showed that by the Soviet Union because it's such a obvious example of people pushing out the Jews in order to reorder the post-war world. But I tried to broaden the concept in a sense, saying, or claiming, maybe putting it to discussion, that by not admitting Jews into one's own country, you don't have to deal with the topic of the post-Shoah. You push it towards this other country that they're asking for, and it's amazing to support them. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that wasn't a nice positive outcome, but some of the reasoning behind it might have had anti-Semitic sentiments for not wanting to deal with Jews, for not wanting to let them enter, especially not when they are being ill or old. That was part of the thing I tried to patch up.
And what is this pushing out of Jews by the Soviet Union? I don't know about that.
So by what Cohen talked about in his philo-Semitism studies, he concentrates on the Soviet Union promoting Jews to go to Palestine by not calling them their own citizens, while at the same time they're calling back the other Soviet DPs, or what they called to be Soviet DPs by the Yalta Conference. They wanted to have them back so desperately, but they tried to exclude Jews. And they promoted to let the Jews go to Palestine instead of admitting they came from the places we rule. So let's have them back. Instead of doing that, they promoted to let them go.
Gosh. Any other questions? Okay. Yes, there's more in the chat.
Nice.
This is from Anne Friedrichs. This is a very rich and stimulating talk, I agree. I found your point about thinking anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism together very interesting. My question would be, are there also counter tendencies, and can different forms of counteracting anti-Semitism be observed?
Good one, thank you, Anna. Anna is my PhD advisor, mine's Germany. Can there be different forms of counteracting? Definitely. So what I just tried to describe to Crispin was that by supporting the Jewish plight, the Soviet Union could ignore that most of the Jews, or many of them, came from their territory, but within the international organizations, thinking about Jewish humanitarian aid organizations in the United States, like the Joint or HIAS and so on, there is a lot of sympathy for the Jews that I would never claim to be anti-Semitic. There's a true cause of realizing the post-Shoah. Again, there's a rupture going on, realizing what has been going on, and therefore they are changing their stance against anti-Semitism. So it's just multi-layered, multifactorial. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does.
I realize I've terribly neglected everyone in the room who might have questions. I just have been kind of focused down here. In terms of people here today, any questions you'd like to ask?
Are there any examples of states trying to encourage or incentivize displaced Jewish people to return?
To their own states?
Yeah.
For sure. For example, the Western states, the Jewish people that came from Belgium or the Netherlands, they were welcomed back. They had positive experiences. And even though there was anti-Semitism going on, for example, in Poland, that does not necessarily mean that all of them suffered, because a lot of them did return and try to build up new lives. So that is actually a good addition to what I was saying.
I don't even know if it's a question or I just want to highlight something that you said that I found really interesting and didn't know that there was a huge shift from victim to perpetrator of the people who were at some point understood as the victims. All of a sudden, there was this really big shift, and it's a very interesting parallel to modern anti-Semitism of a group of people that, you know, were victimized in a way and now all of a sudden are being recategorized. So again, I don't know if there's a question more of like, can you speak more to that? Or I just found it so interesting that that's actually an element of anti-Semitism I had never heard before with regard to the Holocaust, and something that kind of came to my mind of like, wow, we're seeing that now. The definitions of those two words are not always universally understood and often can be kind of.
I'm glad you're raising that, and I totally agree with you that post-Shoah anti-Semitism, where the core is this reversal, is what we are seeing today in many countries, not just Germany. Within the German context, that's what the research on anti-Semitism studies has focused on mostly, because it's so vivid, it's everywhere. Like in the account of this girl who was a kid while the liberation happened, and 50 years after, she still has these images. So coming from a German perspective, it's not surprising for me, even though it is interesting to see a shift that why these things can happen too.
Since the evolution of the different terms apply for Jews and other displaced person, and clearly some of these terms are not appropriate in terms of like what they described. Do you think it's appropriate to use these terms right now in historical research of support? What is your approach to that?
That's a very, very good question. For me, it's especially hard to go by the self-description in contrast to the labeling of the administrators, because as you said, some of them are disappropriate. So what I try to do, I don't know if I can hold up to this, but I really try to do that, is to use whatever the person called themselves. So if they call themselves survivor, when I talk about this certain person, I will use that. When they call themselves She'erit HaPleta, which has such a Zionist implementation to it, I use that only when I know the person has done that, because there is Jewish survivors who were against Zionism, who would never call themselves this. So it's messy, and I try to just stay to what the people
If you would like to categorize somehow, like separate, you cannot, yeah, of course you can do it when you cite a certain sort, but like when you try to give a bigger picture, how do you handle that? So saying survivors or displaced persons, or like refugee, or I don't know, like just like I'm just interested.
So far, I'm using displaced person and make a very, as I did today, a very critical claim that this is complicated and includes a lot of groups, but that's so far how I'm handling it. And if you have an idea on how to do that differently, come and approach me about it. I would love that, because I'm struggling with that honestly too.
I think that one of the things, or I guess one of the things that seems so challenging to me about this kind of scholarship is sort of the split brain thing of having to engage with all of this really analytical sort of data-driven work, and then also having to engage with these histories as very, very personal histories and very emotional histories. And I'm just so curious about what that process is like for you, and sort of how you balance and engage with this material with sort of both the analytical and the more emotional brain.
Thank you. That's a very good one. And it's usually a question that keeps to be or is forgotten when you're a historian. People expect you to deal with that as if this would be a day-to-day topic. I tend to speak about the things that disturb me most with people just because I have to. It's very hard to breathe that in, especially when you focus on the post-war and encounter things that still seem very unfair, because obviously morally and ethically we all would have wished for the survivors to have a different story of being treated in a humane way without all the issues that I just raised. But since that's not being the fact, and I'm encountering hundreds of these oral histories, I try to hold back a little, even though it's very hard. But I think in order to analyze it, I can't be emotional all the time. which does not mean that I'm not emotional or passionate about it.
Of course. So another question in the chat, I think going back to the point, or the question I had earlier, weren't the Soviet Jews who left in 1946 actually Polish citizens who were permitted to repatriate to Poland?
Yes.
And it says yet Pilsudski in Poland carried on an anti-Semitic campaign, I guess.
I think connected to that is the entire issue of what the administrator called infiltrees. Yes, they were allowed back to their country, but suffered from anti-Semitism. So after encountering that, many of them fled. And then the things I described to you earlier and that were part of the discussion started because of the mass exodus, scholars call it, of especially Polish Jews going back to Germany. There was this huge discussion because now the DP camps were filled again with Jewish people claiming to be survivors, asking and demanding for somewhere to be sent. So now there's a shift in policy. Now they're promoting, do not come back. Obviously, here's something going on. Go to somewhere else. Supporting the Zionist claim for Palestine, for Israel.
To just kind of get rid of them as quickly as possible so we can shut this operation down, that kind of thinking, or?
Yeah, or by claiming there is no Jews here. We're not a Jewish nation. The Jewish nation is, and we support this. This is what they want to. And obviously I'm exaggerating, right? We're friendly communists who want to have them to have their sovereignty and self-governance. And that is not here, that is there. In a sense, I know that is.
Any final questions before we wrap up? Last moment for the online world to quickly write down a question and submit it. Anyone in the room?
Yeah, and you can also talk to me while we are having lunch.
Yeah. All right, then in that case, I want to say thank you again to Christina for a really interesting, really in-depth and thoughtful talk. And thank you for everyone joining us today. And thank you to Bob Katz for making it all possible in the first place. Greatly appreciated to all.